So you get when you get a CPA, we're very punctual people. Just don't tell my wife I said that because she will not believe you. In fact, don't worry, this isn't going to turn like boomer humor about wives not liking their husbands, but my wife and I are very opposite. In fact, she would make the better CPA than I am because she's the one who keeps everything organized. And I have like my work persona where I'm very organized and detail orientated. Then when I get home, it's like I could walk over the same pair of socks for like a week and not notice and put them in the dryer. So my wife is constantly confused how like I'm this like detailed person at work. But all right, I don't know what got me off on that weird tangent. We're gonna talk about average income today. I wanna get a little baseline and see where we're at. How many people have worked on an average income project? Okay, so we have a couple. How many people think they want to work on an average income project? Notice those who have worked on one didn't raise their hands because they're kind of done with it already. So average income is somewhat new, right? It's a new minimum set aside, but it's been around for a few years now, but it took us a while to get our final guidance to really know what we're doing. And so now we think we know what we're doing. And so I think we're going to see more of these projects. So we're going to kind of today talk about level setting, what is average income. We're going to talk about what projects make a good fit, maybe what projects don't. We're going to talk about some Washington specific rules, and then we're going to dig in at the end and talk about, well, what happens if we screw up with average income? How do we fix it? How much credits do we lose? And all that fun stuff. So let's jump in here. Average income is a minimum set-aside test. We're going to talk a lot about minimum set-aside tests, but this came out March 23rd, 2018. So it's actually 5 years now. It doesn't feel that long ago that it came out, but it's been out for 5 years. And, whoops, that's the wrong button. So when we talk about average income, before we dig into it, this is going to be a key concept we have to understand for everything we're going to talk about today. When we talk about credits, there's two things that we worry about: our minimum set aside and our applicable fraction. And so your minimum set aside, the way I think about this is when you go to like the carnival and there's a sign that says you must be this tall to ride this ride. If you don't meet your minimum set aside, you're kicked out of the program. You're not tall enough to ride the tax credit ride, and you get 0 credits, and things are really bad if you fail your minimum set aside. On the flip side, we have our applicable fraction, and this is the percentage of your project that's affordable. Oh, I forgot you were going to introduce us. Sorry, I just jumped right in. I didn't even introduce myself. Hi, everybody. I just got excited. I saw it was 2 o'clock and just jumped right in. I'm Thomas Stagg. I'm a partner at Novogradac and Company in Bellevue, and I'm excited to be talking about average income today, as you can tell, because I didn't even wait to be introduced. I just jumped right in. But okay, sorry. I digress. There's going to be a lot of digressions today. You have to listen to me for about an hour and 20 minutes. One thing I did want to mention is let's ask questions as we go, because average income, we're going to build on topics. And so if you didn't understand what I just said about the minimum set aside, you're going to be really lost in 5 minutes. So let's make sure that we're asking questions as we go so that we make sure that we're like going on the journey together. I don't want to like get to the end of the journey and you guys are still back home. Okay, so minimum set aside, you got to be this tall to ride the ride. That's if you get any credits at all. Applicable fraction is how much in credits you get. That's basically saying what percentage of your project is affordable. And that determines what percent of your project you can earn credits on. Right? If your project's 100% affordable, you can earn credits on all your units. If your project's only 80% affordable, you're only going to earn credits on 80% of your units, right? So your applicable fraction is telling us how many credits do we earn? Your minimum set aside, do we get credits at all? So when we talk about the average income minimum set aside test, we're going to talk first about the minimum set aside. And when this first came out, the IRS issued really scary guidance. They actually issued it on Halloween, which I thought was funny because it was the most scary guidance we've ever received. And they interpreted this horribly wrong, and I had to multiple times be on panels with the IRS where I tell very nicely, so I'm sitting next to the IRS, well, this is why we think the IRS interpreted differently, and it'd be great if they could read the code in this light and reinterpret it. And lo and behold, they did, and they issued us new guidance. And so now we know that if we can meet our minimum set aside, we qualify for credits. And they clarified that it's just at least 40% of your project has to be rented to tenants whose designations average 60% or less. And so what do we mean by that? If we look at this project here, we see we have 10 units. And so to meet the minimum set aside of 40%, we just need 4 units that are rented at designations that average 60% or less. So there's a bunch of different ways that we could do this, right? You could look and say, well, these 4 50% units are clearly less than 60%. And so this is going to be really important when we talked about non-compliance earlier. I'm sure right now this just makes a lot of sense. You're like, okay, 40%, we average less than 60%. That's great. But this was a big issue in the industry when this guidance first came out, and the IRS has really simplified it. So to determine whether or not we get credits at all for our project, we just have to meet this minimum set aside. So we have to designate our units. We have to rent at least 40% of our units to tenants whose designations average 60% or less. And these permitted designations are in these 10% increments. You can designate a unit as a 20%, 30%, 40, 50, 60, 70, or 80% unit. You cannot designate a unit as a 75% unit. That just doesn't exist for this. It'd be considered an 80% unit for purposes of this average. And so we're averaging the designations. And it's not a weighted average. We're not saying, oh, this 3-bedroom unit has more weight in this average than a 1-bedroom. We're literally just adding up all the designations and dividing by the number of units. So you see here, this one that we did, we averaged 59%. So we're okay because we're averaging less than 60. It's kind of hard to get a project, unless you really deliberately set up that way, that averages exactly 60. So you'll see projects averaging a little less than 60. In this case, it averaged 59. So you can use any of these designations, and we'll talk in a second about how we set these designations and some of the guidance that the commission has given us. And if we're in a multi-building project, so are we familiar with the concept of a multi-building project? So we built a project, right, it has a bunch of buildings. And although the commission says you can't do this, but typically you could take this project that has all these different buildings and you could carve it up into smaller projects if you so desired. You could say, hey, building A and B are one project and building C is its own project. And when you do that, each project has to meet the minimum set aside. If you remember that earlier slide we looked at, the minimum set aside test is a project-wide test. And so as long as the entire project has 40% of its units somewhere across the project that averages 60%, we meet the minimum set aside. And I thought we had an example here, yeah. So we see here, we screwed up in building 2, but we've still met our minimum set aside because in building 1, we have 8 units. This is now a 20-unit project, so 20 times 8 is, 20 units times 40% is 8 units. So we need 8 units that average 60% or less. So we have that, so we met our minimum set aside. So even though we have non-compliance here, and we'll talk about what happens here with our credit flow, obviously we're going to lose credits, right? We're not renting to people that we're supposed to, but we'll still get some credits because we met our minimum set aside. Now I do want to go back to the commission tells us that in order to do an average income project in Washington State, and this all comes from Appendix Q, the commission has a great appendix that talks about their rules in relationship to average income. And they tell us that in order to do average income in Washington State, you have to select that you are part of a multi-building project. And that just makes it easier to comply with some of the various average income rules that we're going to talk about. So that's kind of local knowledge rule number 1. You got to make sure that you're checking yes. And how do we signify that we're a multi-building project? We do that on IRS Form 8609, and it's question 8B. You check yes. You attach a statement to your tax return or to those forms that explain how we're doing this. Okay, so we kind of clear on the minimum set aside. It's pretty easy. We have a big project. We go out and we say, okay, 40% of our units average 60% or less, so we can get some credits now. One more thing from the commission. Oh, and this is just a general reminder. This designation sets both your income and your rent limit, right? So a unit that's designated as 30% has to be rented to a tenant making 30% or less, but also the rent has to be equal to 30% or less. And one other thing that is important to note on this is that these restrictions become reportable requirements. So if you're doing a typical tax credit project in Washington State, you might have had some units that were at 50 and some units that were at 60, right? We've had these projects over the years, maybe some units at 30. And it used to be that if you messed up and moved somebody into a 30% unit whose income was 35% of area median income, you'd be in trouble with the commission because you're violating their agreement. But federally speaking, federally just looked at your project and said, oh, you're a 40-60 project, your set aside is 60%. So as long as you're under 60% federally, the commission could be mad at you, but they could not report that on an 8823. But now, when you say I'm a 50% unit or a 30% unit, if that tenant's over income on that, that's now a federal violation as well as a state violation. And we're going to talk about clearing that up in a minute and how we're going to kind of work around that. But we have to know that we are on more of a, we don't have that natural kind of buffer we used to have where we'd say, oh, if we screw up on a 30% unit, we have some space here before we run afoul of and lose our credits. Okay, so we've talked about 40%. We got to designate our units and meet our minimum set aside. Minimum set aside, reminder, tells us if we get credits or not. Okay, so we need to designate our units. So how do we designate these units? So it's not like you hire like somebody to come out and like they do a ceremony and like bless your units, like I so designate you as an 80% unit, and then it's like locked in. Although if you want to hire somebody to do that, I'm happy to walk around your project and tap each door and give it a designation. So you don't really do that, but you have to record it in your books and records, and you have to track what the designations are. So if we kind of think about this, and we'll look at what the commission tells us in a second, but if we think about designating our units, it's something that you want to put a little bit more thought into than just kind of say, well, when a tenant shows up, whatever income they have, we'll move them in at that designation and we'll be fine. That's not going to work because either you're going to end up averaging like 40% and lose a lot of income, or you're going to end up averaging 80% and run afoul of everything. So typically speaking, you're kind of thinking about your designations long in advance, and your investors are going to want to be able to prove out that those designations actually work in your market, right? So you can't come out and say, hey, I'm going to designate 100 units at 80% and 100 units at 40% in a 200 unit project and just think that's going to work. The investor's going to want to look and make sure that there's enough households at 40% and 80% to make this work. Or you might say, I'm going to designate 20% of my units at 20% and the rest at 80%. Again, we're going to need to prove out that there's enough tenants to qualify for these 20% units, and that the 80% tenants are going to want to live in this project as well. So typically your designations are something that's thought of well in advance. Usually it's thought up during your application process, and you're working that out with your investors, lenders, and state agencies, and making sure it's right for your market. But the good news is that those designations can change over time. And so if you start out and saying, yeah, I want 50% at 40, 50% at 80, and that works, and then suddenly something happens where the 80% units are no longer feasible, then you can kind of adjust over time to a certain extent. We'll talk about some kind of limitations on that. So new project, you're basically making your designations before you're moving in tenants. And those designations are really kind of locked in once you've moved a tenant into that unit, especially if you're right at 60%. Because if you're right at 60%, if a unit becomes vacant, you need to continue to rent at that same designations to maintain that 60% average. Now, sometimes you might want to change the designation on a vacant unit, and that's allowed. If a unit's vacant, you can change the designation, but you have to be careful, right? Because if I'm averaging 60% and I have a vacant 40% unit, and a 50% household wants to move in, if I designate that unit as a 50%, what's happened to my average? It's gone up, right? Now I'm going to average over 60%. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's a bad thing, right? Hopefully we've all tracked that so far. That's a bad thing. We don't want to average over 60%. So usually what you have to do if you're going to kind of reconfigure your mix, you'd have to first move a unit down, and then your next vacant unit you can move up. So that balancing is kind of hard to do once you have a project that's occupied, especially if you're a project that has very little turnover. If you're a project that has a lot of turnover, you might be able to do this a little bit easier. I'm thinking like if you're a senior project, typically we don't have a lot of turnover at senior projects. That might be wrong. I don't do anything. I'm just an accountant. I don't know how to manage a project. So we have to think about our designations, but they can change. And if we do screw up, as we're going to talk about later, we need to catch that and fix it before the close of the year to have the most desirable outcome. We can catch it and fix it later, but if we catch it and fix it later, we're probably going to lose some credits. And so we want to make sure that if for restoring the project average, we got to do that before the close of the year. Don't worry, we're going to look at a lot of examples on that. So the IRS says that when we're changing designations, these are kind of the permitted times when we can do it. I love the first one, as allowed under future IRS guidance. So they're like saying, hey, if we tell you can change it because of this, you can change it because of this. It's like, okay, IRS, well, great for letting me know that you might give me something. Or as allowed under your allocating agency policy. So we're going to look at the next slide. The commission is very generous with allowing you to change your designations. They have one of the best policies in the country, I think, with average income. I'm not saying that just because I want them to take my calls later on when I have questions. They have a very good policy in relationship to this. So as allowed under your state agency. Certain laws, so fair housing. This was a big issue when this first came out, so just kind of looking back. When the IRS gave us that Halloween guidance, they said you can never change a designation once it's locked in. And we're like, well, IRS, what happens if we have somebody with a fair housing request or an ADA request and they need a 30% unit on the first floor and all of our 30% units are on the third floor? What do we do? And the IRS listened, and so you can always change designations if you need to because of a fair housing requirement. The other one's tenant movement. So if a tenant wants to transfer, right, you can change designations because of that transfer, and that's even true if you're transferring market rate units. So you can change designations because of that. And then finally, restoring compliance with average income requirements. And we're going to talk about why we would need to do this. But what's interesting about this is, and now this is when the commission's going to get mad at me, is I think that number 5 trumps any commission rules. So if they're like, hey, you can't change designations except for this, but you need to change a designation to restore compliance, you can do that and be okay federally. You're just going to have an issue with the commission. But we have such a nice commission, I would say, let's call the commission and talk to them, and then we're probably not going to have an issue with them. Some states, it's like, you just do it and you just hate your commission, and that's how it works in those states. We don't have that here. Here, if you had an issue where you had to change a designation that didn't comply with the state policy, which I can't really think of here, how that would happen, but if you did, you could change it and be okay federally, and then you and the commission are going to have to duke it out at some point. Maybe like a karaoke sing-off or something. All right, so let's look at the commission. Oh, one more thing. When you change the designations, you got to make sure you're recording this somewhere, right? We have to have an audit trail so we can prove out that our designations average 60% or less. So you need some sort of software or something that is tracking these designation changes. And number 2, you got to tell your state agency. So you can't kind of just sneakily do it and be like, oh, sorry, state agency, I hope they don't notice. You have to notify the state agency. So they're going to find out. So that's why you don't want to, you probably wouldn't want to follow them, but if you had to, you should let them know in advance because they're going to find out either way. So the commission tells us that you're not required to pre-assign, and this again comes from Appendix Q from the commission. So you're not required, owners, to pre-assign a units. You can modify your units as needed. The key is, let's see, where's the one I was looking for? You cannot change to a higher designation. So what does that mean? It means if I have a tenant who's in a 50% household, I can't suddenly say, hey, I'm going to change you to a 70% household, and now you have to pay 70% rent. The commission says, no, you can't do that unless that tenant was really a 70% household from day one, and there was just a compliance issue in the file, and you say, oh, you're really a 70% household. Then you can correct that error, but you can't move somebody up. But you can move them down. So if the only vacant unit was a 70%, and that tenant was really a 50%, when you have another vacancy, you could then move that guy down to a 50 and move a 78% into a vacant 50. You know, we don't, I would say, I don't like playing a lot of games with our designations because that's how we screw up. Some companies are going to be very aggressive with this and try and right-size it every time. But for the most part, I think your designations, you should set them and forget them until like there's something going wrong with your project with too many vacancies or something like that. But at the same time, you can lower tenants' designations as needed. And then if you make a low-income set-aside commitment in your application, you got to stick to that. And so what do I mean by that? Like during your application, well, let's look at the example from the commission. This is, again, from Appendix Q, 100 total unit project. That's a lot of units up here. No, you can barely even see the green box. You agree to set aside 50% of your units at 30%. Then the commission says, hey, for the rest of the units, you can pretty much do whatever you want as long as you average 60% or less. Oh, whoops, sorry. I lost my average thing here. And so we see here, if you did 50% at 30, well, guess what? The rest of your units can be 80% and you'll still average less than 60. So you can basically designate these any designation you want and still average less than 60. But the key is if you told the commission you're going to do something, you got points for that in your application, you got to stick to that. And so you need to lock that in. Nope, that's the same slide again. One other thing about the commission is there's a unit parity requirement. So you can't put all of your 80% in the biggest unit and think, I'm super smart. I'm putting all my 80% in the biggest unit, so I'm going to get the most rental income from these big units. I'm going to put all my 40% in my smallest. That doesn't work. The commission wants parity, right? So we have an 80, a 60, and a 40 kind of at each unit size. Now, of course, it's going to be hard to get exact parity in a lot of examples. It's easy here. We have 3 set-asides and 9 units. We can make it work. But you need to make sure that you're doing your best efforts to keep that unit parity, that you're not putting all your 80% in the biggest units or things like that. Okay. Any questions on designating units? So we're going to come back and talk about changing designations to cure noncompliance in kind of the second half of this presentation. But for now, we're kind of good. We got our units. We've designated them. They average 60% or less. At least 40% of our units are designated so that we meet our minimum set aside. And now we can talk about, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. So now we can talk about how much credits we actually generate on our project. And that's really kind of what we're here for, right? We want to generate credits. We don't want to just do affordable housing. Well, maybe we do want to do affordable housing for fun. That's also why we're here. But we want to make sure that we're getting the credits so we're getting our equity so we can build this affordable housing and build more. So again, coming back to this slide, now we need to shift over and say, okay, we qualify for credits. We met our applicable fraction. We've designated our units. I'm sorry, we met our minimum set aside. Now we need to talk about our applicable fraction, how much credits we're going to generate. And this applicable fraction kind of stays with us for life of this project. And any year we could screw this up and lose credits. And so we need to make sure that we're really focused on this. And a couple of things about this is your applicable fraction is a building-based rule. And so if you have noncompliance in a building, you're going to lose credits on that building. And so we really get very granular on that here. And it's also the lesser of the unit size or square footage fraction. We're not going to really talk too much about that. But let's look at our example project here. We've designated 5 units at 50, 5 units at 70. That average is 60. Trust me, I'm an accountant. Eligible basis, we spent $10 million to build this building. Yeah, $1 million a unit. That's a little expensive. These are nice units, I guess. I know it is real though, right? I remember my first project that hit $1 million per unit. I was like, how? And now it's like, yeah, don't do deals in San Francisco. That's all I'll say. Okay, or maybe Seattle too. It's getting there. Okay, but I digress as usual. Yeah, it's a 9% project, so we're going to multiply it by 9%. We get $900,000 of credits. We're 100% affordable, right? This looks very familiar. We're used to this type of project. Oh, guys, we messed up. We moved in an unqualified tenant. I don't know what we did here. Maybe they're a full-time student. Maybe they actually have 2 jobs we forgot to verify and they're unqualified. We messed up. So in the normal tax credit world, we'd say, okay, guys, we lose credits on this unit, right? Our applicable fraction is now 9 out of 10, so we're 90%. So we'd come back up here, we'd do our math, and instead of getting $900,000 of credits, we get $810,000 of credits. We lose $90,000 of credits, which makes sense. 10% of our project is out of compliance, so we lose 10% of our credits. But unfortunately, in the average income world, it doesn't work that way because we see here, we look at our building now, and we average more than 60%. And the IRS says that is bad. And we did try and battle the IRS on this a lot that said, hey guys, it's still rented as designation. It's still a qualified unit. We didn't move in like 120% person here. Like this 70% unit should still earn credits. There's a qualified tenant in there. The IRS said, no, that's not how it works. they introduced this brand new term that's never existed in tax credit before that's called a grouping of qualified units. And so when we're talking about a grouping of qualified units to earn credits for our applicable fraction, we can only include units in there that average 60% or less. And so we can come out here and pick any grouping of units as long as that grouping averages 60% or less. And so that introduces this other new term called an excluded unit, which again, never existed before and doesn't really make sense. Why am I excluding a unit that is income qualified and rent qualified? Why am I having to exclude this? But for whatever reason, the IRS was hyper-focused on we have to average 60% to earn credits. And so what happens is we end up excluding this unit so that we have a grouping of qualified units here that average 60% or less. So what does this mean? It means our applicable fraction is only 8 out of 10. So we had 1 unit go out of compliance, but we lose credits on 2 units. So that's really the big concern with average income, is that there's potentially this multiplying effect here where we say 1 unit of noncompliance might result in 2 or more units of lost credits. So now if we do our same math here, we now only get $720,000 of credits. We've lost 20% of our credits, even though only 10% of our units are out of compliance. So this is the big concern with average income that people have. And we'll talk more. Whoops, I didn't mean to show that yet. That's going to be in our examples later on. So we have to realize that with average income, there is kind of this compounding effect of losing multiple units. So again, now we have this new concept, a grouping of qualified units. And the grouping of qualified units looks a lot like our applicable fraction, but we're actually able to look across the entire project. So we could have 1 building that averages 65% and 1 building that averages 55%, assuming they're the same number of units, and still have a grouping of qualified units that averages 60% and be able to take credits on those. So it allows us to look across the entire project for this grouping. And that's also true for, I should have mentioned this earlier, when we're talking about averaging 60%, again, it's a project ride rule. And so therefore, you can have buildings that are slightly over 60% as long as it's offset with another building that's slightly under. Yeah? Yeah, so this is this concept called buffer units. And so the question is, would you recommend having buffer units so that when this unit goes out of compliance, you don't have this compounding effect? And I'm going to table that question and come back to it when we talk about noncompliance. And I think that under the old rules, a lot of investors were requiring buffer units because they were very worried about this. Under the new rules, we're not seeing as many buffer units. I'll talk about why in a second. But that's a great question. Do we want to have some sort of buffer here, whether it's averaging less than 60%, so that if 1 unit goes out of compliance, we're not over that 60% average, so we still only have that 1 unit out of compliance, 1 unit of lost credits? Or do we have just additional low-income units, so that if something goes out of compliance, we swap them in? And we'll talk about why we're not as focused on that anymore, but that was definitely the early solution to this. But so we have this grouping of qualified units. That tells us how many units we can claim credits on, and again, we claim them on a building-by-building basis. So you might be saying, well, Thomas, that sounds horrible. I screw up 1 unit, I might lose like double my credits, maybe triple my credits if it's like a 20% unit that went out of compliance. I'm not liking that. So why might we do average income? So there's some projects that lend itself very well to average income. I'm actually flying through this, so if you have more questions, we can talk more. I get so excited I talk fast, I know. Okay, so number 1, this is the biggest advantage of average income, is we're able to better align, we're able to better serve our population. Before average income, nobody over 60% could qualify for tax credit housing. So anybody who is in this 60 to 80% range, they're completely excluded from this program. They could not benefit. This allows people that are in the 60 to 80% range to benefit from it. But also it allows us to have better targeted income levels so that people making 14%, they could qualify for a 20% unit if you had one, and only pay 20% rent, as opposed to, I know that most states have deeper targeting, et cetera, but federally speaking, it used to be only a 60% or a 50% unit. So this 20% tenant, even if they moved into a 50% unit, they're going to be heavily rent burdened. And so we're trying to figure out how do we better stratify our portfolio at a federal level and encourage that. And there's another slide where I talk about some benefits that are related to this as well. So that's number one, to better target our units. Number two, along the same line, is this self-subsidizing our units. So in the past, if we had these deeper targeted units because the state wanted us to have these deeper targeted units, usually we'd have to have some sort of subsidy on these units. And that'd either be, there's multiple ways to do it. Right now we're showing as a rental subsidy. It might have been a low interest rate loan from the city. It might have been a grant from somebody else. But we had to have something to basically subsidize this deeper targeting because we're getting less rental income. I cherry-picked a very simple example here where we say, well, now at 50% in King County, this 10-unit project would generate $1,500 of rental income, and we'd need rental assistance of $3,000 to get us back to our 60% rents. But now, in average income, we can still have our 30s and 40s and 50s in this project, but instead of having 60s, we have 80% units. And again, this is a cherry-picked example. I know that it'd probably be more stratified, et cetera. But now we're able to achieve that 60% rent and not need any outside subsidy for this project. So it allows us to have a more stratified portfolio, or a stratified population. I don't know what the term I'm looking for is. You probably don't either, if I don't, without having to look outside for additional rental assistance. And so that was a big point of average income, as a way to figure out how do we serve these deeper targeting without having to dig into somebody else's pockets. Now, what we're seeing happen though on a lot of these is we're still averaging 50%. We have some 80% in here, and we're still getting some rental assistance, right? Because we want to drive down as much as possible when we have the assistance. All right. Acquisition rehab. This has been huge for acquisition rehab, particularly like a RAD transaction. Are you familiar with RAD? That's where you're taking a Section 8 project, or not Section 8, an old public housing project, and you're rehabbing it. And because of those public housing rules, your existing tenant population has to stay in those units, basically, or you have to pay them a lot of money to do uniform relocation. And so at rehab, you'd come out and look at this project, you say, oh my goodness, I have these tenants that are 80 and 70%, and you'd either have to pay them money to leave or forego the credits on those units. And so average income allows you to keep those tenants that are earning up to 80%. Now, it's not a panacea, right? You might still have tenants that were at, this guy's at 90%. We can't help him. You still are stuck in that same boat. But we found on a lot of the RAD transactions we're working on, most of these tenants that were previously over income for tax credits and were losing credits really did fall in that 70 to 80% range. There weren't many that were at that 90, 100, 120%. So yeah, you maybe still have 1 or 2 units across the entire project, but it's really helped with the RAD transactions. And on top of that, on RAD transactions, what's interesting, these were some of the first average income projects that were done, were the RAD transactions, because investors were very nervous about the 80% units because they were really nervous about achieving those rents. But in a RAD transaction, typically A, you have rental subsidy on all your units, and 2, when that 80% unit moves out, you're renting to a 50% household typically. So you're kind of getting right back into the wheelhouse of what you do best. And so RAD transactions, acquisition rehabs, average income works really well with that because it allows us to keep the tenants in place and allows us to go up to a higher level if it's not a RAD transaction, it's just a typical rehab, as you guys are going to talk about. And then it can also help with vacancy. And this is kind of big in rural projects. So what I hear from people in rural projects is they have a lot of tenants that come in that are making like 65% of area median income. And they'd have a lot of vacancies in your traditional 40-60 project because the residents are making just a little too much to live there. But in an average income project, so we have the 60% unit here, hey, they make less than $30,000. They're okay, that's great. But they make $32,000, they can't qualify for any units in this project because it's over 60%. But if we change this project to an average income project, we could designate that as a 70% unit, go all the way up to $35,000 and qualify them. But what's interesting about this is a lot of these projects, you can't actually achieve the 70 or 80% rent in a lot of the rural areas. And in fact, when I talk to a lot of people who are doing projects out there, they can't even achieve the 60% or 50% rent sometimes. So this doesn't necessarily help you suddenly charge the 70% rent and juice your rental income, but it does help you avoid the vacancies of those tenants who are coming in, right at that 62, 65% income level. And so when we look at average income projects, those are the big ones. And then the final one that I didn't build a slide for is just you're in an urban area that has people at every strata, and you want to have a very kind of diverse population. You want to have 80s and 40s and 60s, and it creates a more blended household or blended community. And so that's another strong place where we're seeing average income. Now, there are some things that we can't do average income on. The commission says projects must be 100% affordable to do average income. So mixed income projects don't work. Now, this does pose an issue if you're doing a RAD transaction or an acquisition rehab where you're trying to do average income and you have that one tenant who is that 90% household who can't qualify. Again, we have a great commission. If you have that case, let's talk to them, right? In my experience, the commission's going to work with us and figure out a way to make it so that maybe we can do this. I'm not guaranteeing the commission's going to say, yeah, you can do it because our policies say you don't. But I wouldn't walk away from a prime RAD transaction or a prime acquisition rehab just because you might have some tenants that are over 80%. And then number two, re-syndications. So re-syndication, exactly what it sounds like. We've had tax credits on a project. We're going to do a new allocation of tax credits on it. In a re-syndication, you're still subject to that old regulatory agreement. And that old regulatory agreement, because average income's only been around for 5 years, that old regulatory agreement is probably a 40-60 set aside. And so you have to comply with that for that full term of that old regulatory agreement, which is at a minimum 30 years federally and longer here often in Washington State. And so you can't suddenly do average income on your project because you'll be violating your old regulatory agreement for any household that's a 70 or 80% household. So what the commission says is, yeah, you can elect this on your new re-syndication, but you got to wait for those old regulatory agreements to wear off, and then you can start doing average income. And so you're really kind of looking down the road and saying, okay, I'm not going to be able to move in 80 or 70% tenants until this wears off, but maybe I'm going to do a second re-syndication in another 15 years from now when that old one's off, and now I can do 70s and 80%, et cetera. So you're really kind of playing the long con there, the long game, but you can elect it, you just won't really be able to implement it till that old regulatory agreement wears off. Make sense? Sort of. All right. I know a couple people said they're doing average income. Why did you do average income? Those who did it. I think it'd be interesting for the group to kind of learn from what projects are already implementing it here in Washington State. Anybody want to share what they're doing? Yeah. Okay, a RAD conversion. Okay.
And then most of them moved out except one. We were able to offer relocation projects, we were able to offer relocation dollars, and so they moved, but we did have one person who did not move out.
Okay.
And we were the first one. It was in 2018, so we didn't know what we were doing at that time. So we worked with Thomas and the commission through that process.
Yeah. And now it's a great project, right? Yeah. Anybody else wants to share what they've done? All right. So yeah, the ones I've worked on in Washington State have mainly been RAD transactions so far. I've worked on a couple new construction ones in Washington State where they're doing it to kind of just have that more diverse population. One thing that I didn't build a slide for that we'll talk about a little bit, if you're a project that gets a lot of tenant-based vouchers, doing average income can really increase your rental income for your project. And what do I mean by that? So let's come back here and look at a sample project. I'm just going to use this one here for our discussion. So we see, this 30% or this 50% household. If you're able to move a tenant-based voucher tenant into one of those units, if you have a tenant-based voucher, that tenant-based voucher basically pays you fair market rent, right? Which is akin to, close to a market rate rent for that unit. But when you're looking at your average income, that 30% unit allows you to have a unit at 80% and 70% and still average 60%. So you're getting a fair market rent for this 30% unit, plus you're able to have an 80%, which I don't have on here, and a 70% unit as well, and average 60%. So now the average rent that you're collecting is way more than 60% because that 30% has a voucher. So that's one reason why some people are really pursuing this on new construction, if they're really good at collecting voucher rents on their tenants. And it's kind of a little bit of a loophole. Just so you know, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which is what it sounds like, the act to improve the affordable housing credit, also known as a tax credit, actually has a provision that says if you select average income, you might not be able to use that loophole anymore. But everybody we talk to on the Hill says that part of it's never going to pass. That's just to appease people. But just know that if you're doing average income, that's a good way to kind of really juice your cash flow on your project. All right. Other reasons why you might do average income. Anybody else want to share? Nope. Okay. So let's talk about the meat of this, the non-compliant section. So when we have non-compliance, let's take this stroll down memory lane to make sure we're all grounded together. So first, we have to remember we have this new concept we've never had before about this grouping of qualified units. In order to claim credits on a unit, it has to be part of a grouping of qualified units, meaning that it and its friends in this group all have to average less than 60%. And that grouping tells us how much in credits we can take. Shoot. There's supposed to be something that pops up on top of this, but apparently I'm not very good at making slides. So the other stroll down memory lane is our excluded units. So if we remember, if we have this unit that's over income and we're averaging more than 60%, we may have to exclude a unit to get below 60%. So we have this new thing of excluded units. Even though that unit is income and rent qualified, we have to exclude to get below 60%. And the third thing that was our stroll down memory lane that's hidden from our memory is that we can change designations, and there's certain permitted times that we're allowed to do that. So let's look at some non-compliant situation here. Okay, hopefully I didn't mess up the rest of the slides. So we got this great project here, kind of setting us up. We have building B averages 65%, building A averages 55%. Is this okay? Yeah, because we look across our entire project. Our entire project averages 60%. So we're okay. We group these units together. We have a grouping of qualified units. We can take credits on all 20 of these units right now. No problem. But, we messed up. In one of these units, building A has a 40% AMI designated unit that is unqualified to do a household income exceeds 40%. Oh, shoot, guys, we messed up. We moved in an unqualified household. We don't average 55% now because that unit's not compliant. If it's not compliant, we can't include it in our average. So we got to pull that out. Now building A averages 56%. 56 plus 65 divided by 2 is greater than 60%. It's 60.08 or something like that. No, look at my bad math. 61.05. So we're in trouble, right? We can't claim credits on this unless we do something. So this is where this excluded unit comes into play. So we have to find a unit, and I always think of these units as like couplets. So like a 40% unit and an 80% unit are like soulmates because together they average 60%. A 50% and a 70% are soulmates. If you're a 60% unit, you're your own soulmate. So maybe some of us, maybe our 60% units going throughout life, we're our own soulmates. And it's up to you to decide if you're the 40 or the 80 in your relationship. But we have the 40 and the 80, and so we have to exclude an 80% unit here. And now once we do that, we have this grouping of qualified units that averages 60%. So we're okay now to take credits. But as we talked about earlier, well, guess what, guys? Now we have to look at our building for our applicable fraction. Again, we do our applicable fraction on a building by building basis. So even though this building, averages less than, well, let's look at this one. Even though this building averages 60%, it's part of a grouping of or averages greater than 60%, sorry. It's part of a grouping of qualified units that averages 60% or less. So I can count every unit that's in this grouping of qualified units in this building. There's 9. So I'm going to take credits on 9 out of the 10 units in this building. And this is really lame, right? This building did nothing wrong. Everybody's qualified in it, but we're losing credits on this building regardless. And this building, again, we're losing credits on it. So we're taking, instead of losing 1 unit, we're losing 2 units, as we talked about earlier. So let's look at another scenario here. Assume the units in building B are smaller than the units in building A. Building A has a 50% AMI designated unit that's unqualified. To claim credits a 70% unit, right, we have to exclude a unit again, right? We have a non-compliant unit, we're averaging more than 60%. But what we're getting at here is when you're finding your matching couplet, you want to look at what's going to do the least amount of damage to your credit flow. And so our credits are based on how much it costs to build a unit, more or less, right? And so in this case, it costs less to build a smaller unit. So if you have your option of what a unit you're going to exclude, you're going to pick the smallest possible unit to exclude. And this isn't playing some game because, again, you're still going to charge this guy affordable rents. He's still going to be income qualified. You're just excluding that unit to mitigate the damage to your credit flow. So you want to kind of be strategic on which one you exclude. Now, hopefully we don't have to ever exclude any units, and we're going to talk about how we get around that in a second. So again, double the pain on this because we have 2 units. But not so fast. Let's talk about this. So we don't really want to exclude a unit, right? Who here wants to lose credits on 2 units? Nobody, right? We don't want to lose credits on 2 units. So we want to look at this and say, well, can we fix this? Because remember, when we scroll down our memory lane on the slide we can't see, we can change designations. And when we're renting up units, we often find that somebody's moving into a unit that doesn't necessarily exactly match their AMI, right? And so we look here and we look at our tenants and we say, hey, guess what, guys? When this guy moved in, he was a 35% household, but we only had a 50% house unit vacant. And they're like, hey, I'll take 50% over a market rate unit, right? In this case, we had a 58% household that moved into a 70% unit because we didn't have any 60% units. So can we change this designation and cure this issue altogether? So we come out here, we change this designation to 60. It's fine. That tenant has always been less than 60%. And what's interesting about this, the guidance tells us we don't have to go back in time and fix this tenant's rent. We fix this from this time forward, assuming we catch it before the close of the year. And so if we catch this in, let's say, October, we're like, oh, guys, panic time. Let's go check this out. And we find this guy's a 58%. In November, we start charging them a 60% rent, and we change their designation to 60%. We're good because now we average 60% for this project, and we can claim credits, and we only lose credits. We don't have to exclude a unit anymore because we're averaging 60% based on our grouping of qualified units. And we back to our olden days of just losing credits on that 1 unit. So that's if we catch it before the close of the year. We can do that. We're going to talk in a second. I want to finish this example, and we can talk about some of the more nuances of this. But let's take a closer look at this unit that's non-qualified. Why are they not qualified? And it turns out that they're actually just at 51% of area median gross income. Well, that still could be a qualified unit, right? So if we can come out and say, well, you are actually a 60% unit, well, let's designate you 60%, and now I've moved this designation from 50 to 60, and this from 70 to 60, so now I've moved both units both directions, and now I average 60% again for the entire project, and now I'm back in the money. I don't have to lose credits at all on this project. So when we have a unit that's out of compliance, we don't want to panic and say we're losing credits on both units automatically. We really want to step back and think about what's going on at our project and understand our tenant population and understand how we can fix this. But the key is to have the best chance of fixing this, we got to do this before the close of the year. And so with average income, with all tax credits, close of the year is the most important time of the year. The IRS takes this very kind of strict snapshot approach and says that we only look at non-compliance at the close of the year. If you're out of compliance at the close of the year, you lose credits for the whole year. If you're in compliance at the close of the year, you get credits for the whole year, unless we're in the first year of the credit period where we do this month-by-month calculation. But outside that, as long as we're back in compliance at the close of the year, we're fine. But what happens if, let's go back to this scenario. So what happens if the year's closed? Now it's March and we notice this, and we want to fix this so we don't lose credits in the previous year. What can we do? And this is where it's a little bit more of a gray area, and that's why I don't have a slide on this, because I don't want you to be able to quote me on this. No, just kidding. But I think that there's a couple of things we can do. Number one, we talked about the power of Section 8 units in kind of juicing our rental income. They're also going to be very powerful, I think, in correcting non-compliance. And so this 60% unit that we want to change it to 60%, great, we can change it at that date, and going forward, we're back in compliance. But if this tenant moved in December of 2022, and we fix this in March of 2023, we're still out of compliance at the close of the year, right? And so we're going to lose credits because of that. But if we're able to look at this unit and say, guess what? This was a Section 8 tenant. And so if we look back at their rent, their tenant paid portion of their rent was always less than 60%. Can we go back in time and change that designation retroactively? And the true answer to that is it's unclear. Most compliance people I talk to say, sure, why not? Because that household, technically speaking, always could have been a 60% household. So you're just going back and perfecting that designation. But if you've been charging this person 70% rent, well, you can't go back in time and fix that. So that's where that close of the year becomes really important. If you can go back in a previous year and say, well, their rent was still okay, then I think you can go back in time and change it all the way back to the earliest time that you need to change it. But if you've been charging them a 70% rent, you have to fix that in that same year. Otherwise, the rent issue is going to kill you in the previous year. Does that make sense? It's kind of more like, that's like the 301 discussion, maybe. Yeah. Okay, so the question was, how often can you change the designation? So according to the commission, you can basically change the designation whenever you want, as long as you're changing it down. So you can't change it up unless the tenant was, like in this example, he's really a 51% household. The commission appears to allow you to change him to 60%. But otherwise, yeah, you can change it as much as you want. But typically, we only change it on vacant units, right? Okay. So before you get into that, just...
I have a question.
Yeah.
So when you change it, so in this case, you changed it from 70 to 60. And then let's say that person's income grows. Can you change it back to 70 or no?
So...
Like...
Yeah.
Or you
it's
stuck
a great question.
because that was the original, like,
so
you changed it.
So
Do you reset?
Yeah, it's kind of a two-part answer to this question. Number one is, so this person was a 58 household when they moved in. You change it to 60. According to the commission, if their income then goes up to 75%, right, you're not allowed to change them to an 80% household because you're not allowed to increase their designation unless there was some sort of non-compliance when they initially moved in. So I would interpret that to say that once you bump them down to 60, you can't bring them back up to 70 because you bumped them down and it was not their non-compliance that's causing you to fix it. So I think that the answer to that would be no in Washington State, but I'd be interested to hear from the commission if they have different thoughts on that.
We have no thoughts on that at this time.
All right. They cannot confirm or deny that you can change their designation. But at the same, so what you would typically do then is, so now you're at a different you're at a different unit mix than you wanted, right? When you kind of thought through this project. So likely what would happen if this tenant ever moved out, you'd want to change this unit back to a 50% unit. And then when this unit vacated, you change it back to a 70 to get back to the tenant population you're trying to serve. But you kind of have to do it in that order, because if this tenant moves out first and you change it to a 70, we're right back to our issue where we average more than 60% and you just like mess yourself up again. So you always got to move first, but these are the same size units in this example. So whichever tenant moves out first, you could change them down to a 50, and then when the next tenant moves out, you can change it back to a 70. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but you kind of brought up, well, what happens as tenant's income increases, right? I think we're all familiar with the term the next available unit rule, hopefully. I guess if you do compliance, if you're more of a developer side, you might not be familiar with that term. But there's this term called the next available unit rule that says, hey, this tenant moved in, they're a 50% household. 5 years down the road, they've gone back to school, they got in their, I was going to say PhD, but we know PhDs don't make money anymore. They've gotten their accounting degree, right? It's a nice, strong, solid profession that the most charismatic people go into, just the cream of the crop. They get their accounting degree, and they come out, and now they're making more money, right? And now he's making, let's say, 90% of area median income, but they moved into a 50% household. Does that matter? Is this household still qualified? And the short answer is, yes, that household's still qualified as long as you comply with the next available unit rule. And the next available unit rule says that if somebody goes over 140% of the applicable designation, then the next available unit of comparable size or smaller must be rented to an income qualified individual. So if we're in a 100% tax credit project, what's the one thing we want to do whenever we have an available unit? We want to rent that to an income qualified individual. If we're not doing that, then we probably need to be in a different class right now, and more of a like, this is why you're going to get fired if you don't do this type class. So in a 100% affordable project, the next available unit rule doesn't really matter. And for average income, it basically says that you rent that unit based on its designation. So if we have somebody that's over income in a 50% unit, over 140%, and we'll talk about 140% of what in 1 second, you just rent any available unit at its designation. So even if a 70% becomes vacant, I can rent that to a 70% household because the guidance says you rent it based on the designation of the unit. And so we don't have to do all this complicated swapping status or things like that because we have tenants who have gone over income in a 100% affordable project. And does anybody do projects outside of Washington State? A couple. Well, I was going to say, for all you Washington Staters, we know you have to be 100% affordable to do average income. So guess what? You never have to worry about the next available unit rule. But the next available unit rule is a little bit different for average income because we have all these deeper targeted, right? A 20% unit, 140% of 20% is 28%. That's not a huge change in your income dollar-wise, right? Compared to like 140% of 60%, which is 24%, right? And so for the average income guidance, it says if your unit designation is 60% or less, the next available unit rule is not triggered until you're 140% of 60%. So if you're in a 20% unit, you can go all the way up to 84% of area median income before the next available unit rule will be triggered. Now, if you're a 70 or 80%, it's 140% of your designation. So a 70% unit is triggered at 140% of 70%. But that's all fairly moot because you rent the unit based on its designation. As long as those designations average 60% or less, you're okay. So again, somebody goes over income in this 50% unit. They're over 140% of 60, which would be our measurement for a 50% unit. And we have a vacant 80% unit. We can move in an 80% household. We have somebody that's over 140% of 80%, and we have a vacant 30% unit. We just move in a 30% household. And in fact, that vacant unit, we know we can change designations on vacant units. So if we have a vacant unit, and it's this case where we've had to like change our designations and now we're below 60%, and we can redesignate that unit as 70%, that's fine. Redesignate it, rent it as designation, and you're okay as long as you average 60% or less. Yeah?
So what happens when outside of the sort of, I guess, say tax credit compliance issue. So now you still have the commission's reg, but you don't have, say, the IRS breathing down your neck. So what do you do then?
Yeah, so I think this kind of gets back to this age-old question. As I always tell people, that's why I'm so glad I'm a CPA, not a politician, because I don't have to worry too much about the public policy answer here. But for tax credit purposes, we say a tenant moved in and they're qualified, they get to stay there forever and pay that same rent, even if they better themselves. I know there's this whole public policy point that says, this guy moved into a 40% unit, now like he got stock options at some company he's working with, and now he's like a multi-millionaire, billionaire, and he should probably be out of this unit. But for tax credits, we say we don't care. He can stay there forever. And even post year 15, the commission would say, we still follow the federal rules on this. Even though the IRS isn't monitoring us, our guidance says we follow their rules. So that tenant can stay there. You never have to right size it. Now, of course, I think there is some bad public policy there. If everybody in this project is suddenly making millions of dollars, they're taking away a finite resource from somebody. But we don't really have a mechanism in this program to get them out of those units. Graduate, yeah. I mean, I think it is good. I do often wonder, and again, this is why I'm not in public policy, is should there be a top end that says once you're at 200%, the owner can keep earning tax credits on you, but you go to a market rate rent to kind of encourage them to find housing elsewhere, right? But so far, we don't have anything like that, so they can just stay there. Yeah. Someday we'll have to talk about the project I looked at in, where was it? I can't think of the town. That really shishi town in Colorado. Not Steamboat, Aspen. There's a project in Aspen, and there are a lot of people in there that are making like $300,000 or $400,000 10 years ago when we went and looked at it. But they were initially qualified, and then they just started making more money. And it seemed really wrong to me, but they're kind of allowed to stay. So, yeah.
I work for a local government. We're really interested in going for this route with our projects. Currently, we have a lot of just 50%, 30% units. But just concerned about the administrative burden of doing this as compared to just a more standard 30%, 50% project. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think I should first preface to say, who in here has a project that only has one set-aside target? Right? Unless it's like a 8-year-old bond project, most of your projects now already have multiple set-asides. So we're somewhat used to already managing this. The only difference now with average income, in my opinion, is that failure is a little more costly in the sense that in the past, when we had those multiple set-asides, if we messed up, often we wouldn't lose credits because we're still less than 60%. Now we kind of run into a little bit more where you're right by 60%. But administratively, especially if you're somebody who's making your designations, setting them, and never changing them, it's not that much more administratively burdensome, I don't think. The initial kind of startup of figuring out what the right mix is and getting the right people in those units. But once it's set up, I don't think it's any more work. I don't know. You guys have a few. What do you think? About the same? Yeah, what do you think?
There's subsidy attached, so we're already aiming for a lower AMI between 30 and 50%.
Yeah. So, yeah, right. So, but I mean, that's the great thing. You don't have subsidy. So now you can say, hey guys, we want 40% units, but if you have 80% units, you can still get your average of 60 or whatever your target average was. Maybe your target average was 55. So you say, hey guys, we want you to have this number of 30% units, but the rest you can do what you want with as long as you average our target of 55 and we'll give you our money. And so it allows them to kind of cross-subsidize without having to like dig into another pocket. And that's kind of the point of it. So I think that especially now that we have better guidance from the IRS, with the old guidance, it was really scary. If you messed up on one unit, you could lose all of your credits. But with the new guidance, it's a lot more kind of common sense. We're able to kind of redesignate. Washington State is very user-friendly in the sense of how they let you change your designations. So I think that, to me, it's not that scary here to do it. But you want to make sure that somebody, if this was your first project you're ever doing as a developer, probably don't do average income because you just have to be right on the money on all of your units. But if you're somebody who's done this a lot, then average income to me isn't that different. Yeah.
Could you give an example of a scenario where somebody went over income in an income averaging project and their rent increased? Or is there a scenario in which they would have to move out? I'm just thinking about how relocation expenses might be triggered and how that might impact a project if you have to move somebody out, or if you are required to raise their income or their rent levels, how any local laws restricting those increases might play into all of those compliance restrictions.
Yeah. So again, once you've qualified, you stay at that 50% unit, so you stay at a 50% rent forever, especially when the commission says you can't increase on that tenant. So basically, no matter what happens to their income, they stay there at that 50% rent. Now, if you have like a Section 8 voucher on that unit, right, and that Section 8 voucher says you have to pay 30% of your income, as their income goes up, their tenant paid portion might be greater than the tax credit limit, but Internal Revenue Code Section 42 that governs all this is very friendly on that. It says that if a federal program is requiring them to pay more than what the tax rate limit is, you're allowed to collect that entire amount. So there's really not a scenario where somebody's income increasing would jeopardize, basically, would make you have to either move them up to a higher unit or suddenly have to kick them out of the unit. They can stay there forever, basically.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Somebody mentioned the idea of graduating. So the commission has a program for that. It's called the First Time Home Buyer Program. Now, I've been around for like 25 years. We've seen, this is not the first rodeo where things got expensive or times were high, things. And what properties used to do around that period was they would just put something in the laundry room. You still have those? Do they still have a bulletin board? And just put something about first-time homebuyer program and something that says, oh, I don't have to just stay here. It's a nice place, but I don't just have to stay here and get a down payment, because that first-time homebuyer program includes a down payment, a way to finance, a second loan for financing the down payment. So if you're running into situations where you would like people to progress so that you can continue to fulfill your mission, then please look at that, because there might be a lot of people that are sticking around trying to do that, and they may never get there unless you help them find it.
Very true.
Questions?
I had another point I wanted to make on this, but I've totally lost it now. No, it was before. I lost it before you started. I lose a lot of things. But so before we talk about reporting, kind of just to recap, right? So we have an average income project. In order to determine if we have any credits at all, we have to be able to have at least 40% of our units that can fit into this group of qualified units, right? If we can't find 40% of our units average 60%, we lose all of our credits. But that's a fairly low bar to clear, right? 40%, hopefully, unless you start out at 40%, right? But most of the projects we're doing these days are 100% affordable. So it's a lot of non-compliance before you lose all of your credits. But as we've seen, that when we're talking about the amount of credits that flow each year, it's easier to kind of have this compounding effect. But average income now has a lot of kind of outs here where we can save this by redesignating, et cetera. But I guess to get back to your point, you have to be much more diligent. You really need to be focused on the close of the year. What's interesting about this, when average income first came out, the investors were really concerned about our 70 and 80% units. I think that was from an underwriting standpoint because they wanted to make sure that the deal could actually pencil and pay back the debt, et cetera. But your most dangerous units in an average income project are actually the deeper targeted ones, Because if you have non-compliance on an 80% unit, you don't have to worry about your grouping of qualified units, right? You don't have to really dig into that because if an 80% unit goes out of compliance, that's only going to lower your average, right? So now if you're at 60%, you lose an 80%, well now you're less than 60%. So we're back to that world where it's just one unit, non-compliance on the one unit. But if a 30% goes out of compliance, that might take down 2 or more units unless you have some sort of buffer. So now I want to come back to your question about the buffer. And so it's the deeper targeted units that are the most important. So when I think about managing a project, if I think about where do I need to focus my energies at the close of the year to make sure we're not going to run into a foul of anything, I'm going to first focus on my deeper targeted units first, because that's going to have the bigger compounding effect, right? And that's where I'm going to focus on making sure that I don't have any non-compliance there. I'm going to first focus on anybody that moved in during the year, right? I'm going to do a review to make sure that, hey, my 30s, 40s, and 50s, those are the ones I'm most worried about non-compliance because they're going to have this compounding effect. And so what some people do is they kind of build into this buffer. So they say, yes, I know I can average 60%, but I want to leave myself some room here so that if I do have one unit that goes out of compliance, I don't have this compounding effect. And the question becomes, I look at that as buying insurance. How much do you want to pay for insurance, right? If you average 50%, you're going to have this huge buffer. You're probably, assuming it's a big project, right? You're probably never going to have so many units go out of compliance that you get over the 60% and have to start excluding units. But you're giving up 10% of your revenue every year. Actually more than that, right? Because you're going from 60 to 50. That's 16% of your revenue every year you're giving up. So that's a pretty expensive insurance policy, right? So what we see most people do is they say, I'm going to take my deeper targeted units, and I'm going to count how many of those units I can lose before I go above 60%. And usually I say that you want to have about 3. If you're worried about buffer units, so you want to say, I'm going to average 58%, and that means I can lose my 3 deepest targeted units and still average 60%. And now you have a pretty good buffer. So people have managed projects for a long time. How many times have you had 3 units out of compliance at the same time? Right? That's a pretty good buffer. So that's usually what we think about when we think about this buffer unit. I don't think of it as a percentage like, do I need it to be at 58, 57.5? It depends on your project. I say, take your deepest targeted units and see how many of those you can lose and still average 60% if you're going to build in a buffer. But as we talked about today, you have a lot of mitigation here you can do. And so a lot of people are kind of going away from that buffer because in the past we weren't able to change designations, right? And so you're kind of just, can I say screwed? I think I can say screwed. We're all adults here. You're kind of just screwed, right? But now that you can change designations, that buffer isn't as critical because you kind of often have a natural buffer built into your project. But if you're still paranoid, a lot of investors are paranoid, right? Any investors in the room? They're like the most paranoid people. They probably won't even raise their hand there in the room because they're afraid I'm going to say something mean about them and pick on them. They're so paranoid. But they're always paranoid, so they are still somewhere asking for a buffer still. And that's what we do is we set this project up so it averages 58.5, so that if we lose this unit, we're still averaging 59%, so we're okay. And that's kind of the answer to this if you're really paranoid about not being able to redesignate or anything like that. Yeah.
Speaking of risk and being uncertain, do you find that investors are like the pricing is less, or there's perceived kind of more risk for average income projects?
Yeah, so I think that there are some investors who are still somewhat leery of average income. And so anytime that you're taking some of your investor pool away, you're shifting that demand curve, right? So less people are kind of demanding the credit, so you're going to get a little lower credit price. But I think after this new guidance that we got from the IRS, people are a lot less concerned about average income. And so as opposed to kind of saying you're going to get a lower credit price, what we're typically saying is investors are going to demand a little bit of a buffer potentially and push you down to 58%. Now what we see in a lot of cases is due to the competitive nature of bonds and credits these days, most projects were already averaging less than 60%, right? Because you have to give up some of that to qualify for the credit. So you've already had this natural buffer. So you're not actually doing the buffer to appease the investor, you're doing the buffer to get into the program. And so when you have a buffer, kind of a lot of the concerns go right away. Okay. All right. See, average income's not that scary. Yeah.
You work in states where QAP allows average income that goes to charge over 80%. Because
So-
like that's some local policy initiatives are thinking about having even higher spreads in between the AMI.
Yeah, so unfortunately, when we talked about at the beginning, the permitted designations, you cannot go over 80%. If you go over 80%, it cannot be a credit unit.
And that's nationwide.
Yes, that's nationwide. Yeah. Although, right now, there's the middle income tax credit bill that's in Congress as well. And if that passed, then you could get tax credits up to 120%. Again, that's been in Congress for like 3 years now. Who knows if it'll ever pass? But if it does, then you could potentially go up higher and still get credits. It's a reduced credit though. All right. So just quickly on reporting requirements, we only got about 5 minutes left in my section. Just a reminder that on an annual basis, you need to report all this information to your state agency. You need to identify and report your grouping of qualified units. You need to identify if you've changed any designations, and that's reported to the IRS or to your state agency on an annual basis. So you must report the grouping of qualified units annually, and any changes in designation you have to report when you change that designation. So the states are going to be very involved and very informed on this. The IRS left up to states on how it must be reported, so each state agency is going to have a different way to do it. Obviously here, I think we're going to use W bars. I never know if it's W bars or we bars, but we can also argue about that later. But then this is the key thing here. It's like we've talked about all this stuff that we have to report. If for some reason you mess up, you do have 180 days to cure this. And this is kind of the final thing that's really being debated in the industry is what this 180 days means. Is this 180 days to fix anything? As long as you fix in that window, there's no harm, no foul? Or is it only 180 days to fix specific things? I don't want to get too far off into that tangent now because that's a much more delicate topic, but just know that the commission says that you have 180 days to fix anything, whether you find it or they find it. You let them know, you fix in this 180 days, and they're not going to issue an 8823, if I remember correctly from what Appendix Q told me. So again, the commission's very much on the liberal side of this and on the good policy side. So we have a time window to fix things. Okay. Oh, that's for the next part if we end up wanting to talk about rehab issues. So any final questions on anything average income related? I know I'm tired. You guys are probably tired too, having to listen to me. I can't think of anything worse.
Is there a place where they can get more information?
Yes. So more information. We have a lot of blog posts. So Novogradac and Company, since I didn't introduce myself, you guys don't even know where I work. Novogradac and Company, we have a blog that you can search for average income information. We've written a lot about it. We are talking right now about doing another webinar on this towards the end of the year if you kind of want to dig into it. And of course, if you're looking at doing a project, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to just talk to you, have initial conversations, and see if it makes sense for you. Yeah.
So at this point, we wanted to do like a 10-minute break. So if you can get back by 3:30, nice little potty break. And you're going to want to hear about rehab because what's the other difficult things that you do, you know?
So the goal here is really to address all major capital projects that are overdue, coming due, and set that property up for success for the next 15 years or more. So how do you make this work? Does the property generate enough income that would support a refinance? You have to look at the income. Will you be able to generate higher rents? Even with a resyndication on a tax credit basis, that might not be the case. HUD buildings, a lot of them have mark-to-market rent increases based on rent comparability studies. So it's kind of like threading a needle a little bit, figuring out, can I get that mark-to-market in place to pay for the additional debt that it might take to build out this rehab project in full? But then you also have to look at expenses, building that pro forma. What expense reductions are you going to see? Are you spending $10,000, $20,000 a unit for a turnover because the cabinets and the counters and the bathrooms are completely out of date? Those costs are going to diminish if you are able to include unit renovations in your major rehab project. You're also going to have potential energy savings, low flow water utility cost savings, higher efficiency lighting and energy systems, boilers that cost a lot less to run. All of these are going to result in expense reductions, but you don't want to be too aggressive with your pro forma assumptions, because if they don't come out to play as you expect, you could end up caught short. So really, this is all about your debt coverage ratio. What annual debt payments can the property support? And oftentimes, a refinance is far insufficient to cover the funding need alone. So we have to combine these funding sources. And there's a couple of different ways you can do it. You can include tax credit program funding, if you can get it. You can include an amortizing bank loan. There's public funding available from Commerce, city and county housing levy programs, and then there's often federal funding with loans and grants that can add to the capital stack. Now, there's also the sponsor loan, which is the nonprofit operator's investment, but that's often not going to be returned very likely to the sponsor, meaning the owner of the project. Now, LIHTC, it's competitive. Both between applicants, there's a limited allocation, but internally, as an organization, you have to pick and choose which projects you would like to move forward with bond allocations. You have often a 40-year amortization with balloons, so you'll amortize the loan over 40 years, but it might need to be refinanced with a big balloon payment in year 16 or 17 of the project. So with a 40-year amortization, you're really hoping that you're going to be able to pay off that loan, refinance it. We've been seeing interest rates way higher than we were. So what we're seeing now is kind of the coming doom of, can we refinance these projects at higher interest rates, pay off the principal, and keep these moving forward, or do we have to come up with another plan? Don't wait till that maturity date. So it's often unavoidable. You've really got to plan ahead. That's what asset management is all about. If we tell our development team that they need to fix the problem yesterday, they're going to look at us and say, that's just not possible. So public funder negotiations, they can help funding gaps, and you might need to negotiate relaxation of different AMI levels. That's a hard thing. Maybe the average income tax credit program would help with some of that. So there's a different way of going about this. With tax credit funding, you pay a lot in fixed costs, legal, accounting fees. It can be a pretty significant percentage of the tax credit equity that goes into all of the other people that want a piece of that pie. And the added compliance period or extended use agreements to consider, after that 15 years, you're still stuck in a lot of these requirements. It's really competitive, but it combines with your bank loan and other gap fundings. So why would you do it? Because the equity you get can reduce your overall debt payments. And it supports deeper renovations and improves long-term sustainability of the projects. It really helps to avoid the over-levered and under-renovated problem that comes and bites the asset managers in the tails 10, 15, 20 years down the line. But without LIHTC funding, let's say they said, no, you didn't get a high enough score to get the bond allocation, but you need to do the rehab. You can't necessarily just wait and kick that can down the road, so you've got to find a way to do the cash out refinancing. Combine that with gap funding from your public funders, grants, do a capital campaign. But it is going to be harder to fund all necessary projects. So you're going to have to pick and choose what is critical, and you're going to have to kick some cans down the road.
Yeah, I don't know if this is that working? Okay. Transitioning here a little bit when we're talking about when a project goes from a capital repair to a major rehab would include a relocation. So one thing I want to start with is hire a consultant. That's your best friend when you're working on relocation of residents. So we have, this is a couple of slides I grabbed from a presentation that HOU gave, which is Housing Opportunities Unlimited. They are a relocation specialist we have worked with in the past. Not necessarily a plug for them, they're great, but find one that works for you. But they really do provide a buffer between your property management staff and the issues related to relocation specifically, but also they know the rules, they know all the ways to stay in compliance. So when we need to give notices to residents, how many days do they need to be, what kind of information needs to be on that, and they keep all the compliance in place. So permanent relocation is for residents that would be relocated from the property for more than a year, and if that resident is then considered displaced, and you would have to pay for their relocation, the expenses related to a new rent for up to, I think it's 2 years. But again, that's HOU would help me figure out what those exact requirements are. They help residents find the leases they need and then calculate that difference between what I would have to pay, what they would be paying to stay where they are and the new lease, and then we'd have to pay them that difference. Temporary relocation is any resident is relocated for less than 1 year. And then in-place rehab tenant kind of stays in the unit, and the building can be rehabbed a little bit around them. So I don't know anything about emergency relocation. But there is also emergency relocation. We haven't had to do it. Not on the development side.
Yeah, we have had a little bit of emergency, but usually just a temporary resolution.
But again, this is a little more in depth with from the presentation with HOU talking about their role. So they help us create a relocation plan that gets approved by the city. They help us prepare and distribute the mandatory notices to residents. They hold meetings with residents to make sure they know what's going on, the timing of the project, where they're going to go, what their rent is going to be when they move back in. They are just really important. They help with the moving of residents. They help us find units for residents to move into during a renovation project, and make sure that the reimbursements are getting paid on time. So, compliance, back to you.
I'm not a compliance guru, but I do know some big picture things. Will your project change the AMI levels, or will different set-asides be in place? Maybe you had to make a deal with another funder that lowered the income levels or added additional set-asides that weren't there in the beginning. Will there be a reduction in total units, or will the unit sizes change? Maybe in order to make room for a new boiler room, you had to go from a 3-bedroom to a 2-bedroom on a couple of units, or remove a unit altogether for some other elevator, additional stairway. There's all sorts of code compliance issues that can create this need. So do the residents need to recertify their income and assets to move back in? If they're not tax credit qualified to return, they must be permanently relocated. So getting ahead of these compliance issues helps you plan to reduce the impact on any of your residents that are impacted. So will the rent change for the residents upon moving back in? Maybe the rent that you could charge at max rent makes your pro forma work. But if you're in the city of Seattle, there's an increase limit on an annual rent increase. You can't forget about that. You have to be in compliance with all of the different rules and regulations. So your pro forma's got to be consistent with the laws within the city or county that you are working. Do any of your funding sources lower the AMI or require rent reductions? We had a very interesting situation where there was a discrepancy between a covenant and a loan agreement. It got noticed during the rehab, and we actually had to lower AMI levels, and that wasn't even a tax credit project. It wasn't planned, But we figured it out. Some residents were actually rent burdened, so we were able to do a little bit of this moving around AMI levels and make it work. And will the restrictions on full-time students impact any household's ability to return? If you didn't have a tax credit program before and you just made it work with other public funding with the strings attached, you might have students living in the units, full-time students. They can't come back in a tax credit world. So some of the other issues, when is the placed in service date? I mean, if you don't get a temporary certificate of occupancy, what date does that qualify as? So these are just questions. Another one, big one, what's included in basis?
It's me again. The answer is unclear. So again, and a little bit back to the last slide here. What is the place in service date? Like this one in basis is like, you're also going to be working with your accountants, probably Novogradac, to figure out the nuance of these things. Because if it's an acquisition rehab, the building may place in service before the unit's place in service, and you just want to make sure you're considering those things in advance of applying for and recruiting your investors. But what's in basis as far as relocation, it is also something that's unclear. So I know we were just working on a closing for a project, and our accountant, which was not Novogradac, was kind of taking a more conservative approach and saying that our relocation costs for a temporary relocation, which would be something residents would have to do in order for the construction activities to take place, would not count in basis. And this is coming from the fact that the tax code says that it would, because it's an expense that's related to construction activity, could be included in basis, but then the IRS audit technique guide came out and said that it's not. So depending on your accountant, they may give you different feedback, and I would say here, do some homework, push back, call some other accountants. We were ready to go with another accountant just to keep this issue moving forward and keeping that in basis. So your consultants on these are important.
Yeah, don't know more than you know. Pay the people who know what you don't know. So URM, does everybody have the concept of an unreinforced masonry building? How many in the room have unreinforced masonry buildings in their portfolio? We do at Community Roots. So they're basically older, multiple-story red brick buildings that are known to be unsafe in an earthquake. They're built without steel reinforcement or sufficient connections between the walls and the floors of the building, and other structural elements like even the roof. So the seismic retrofits really reduce the likelihood that a building will collapse. It's not going to prevent damage to the property, but it will prevent lives being lost more likely than not. The idea is to keep the building from going down like a pancake, one floor onto the other, harming and killing occupants, allowing them the chance to escape the property unscathed. So the costs of these the seismic retrofits that are required often require a lot of creative and complex funding solutions. It can add years to the process. The URM buildings across the country and across the world include all sorts of different types of properties: apartments, office buildings, schools, emergency facilities, including hospitals and fire stations. And they're found across Washington state. So in 2016, Seattle had conducted a study of all of the masonry buildings in the city, and they came out and identified 1,100 properties across the city. They also proposed a retrofit ordinance requiring owners to bring the buildings into compliance over time. 10 of CRH's Community Roots Housing's buildings were on this list, And we didn't agree with all of them. So we had an engineer come out to evaluate the 10 identified plus 5 additional masonry buildings that we had in our portfolio, just to make sure we knew what we were dealing with. The engineer found 7, not 10, were URM, and they will require retrofits under the proposed legislation. But 3 were actually removed from the city's list. In addition to that, there's other CRH masonry buildings that have seismic deficiencies, and they will require major retrofits upon rehab. Funding these retrofits is really imperative to preserving the unreinforced masonry buildings. This is the properties that give character to our old historic districts, downtowns across the country. Many people have a great love for preserving these types of buildings, but if we come out with an unfunded mandate, it's going to result in what you saw throughout Northern California after they imparted their rules. Many buildings were demolished. So my hope is that we can find a way to line the funding up to preserve these buildings over the long haul. But community roots housing can't wait. We have to take opportunities when they're available. So we started. So what's a URM building? How do you look at a brick building and know whether or not it's likely URM? So there's a diagram here on the wall, and then there's sort of a cross-section. Thank you, City of Seattle, for this great diagram. So the header courses on the brick, and then, so there's header bricks here that are sort of sticking in, and then there's the bricks that are sort of laying sideways. The evidence that it's likely URM is when you see those header bricks. That's the first indication. So what happens if you don't have URM retrofits? The parapet can break right off the building in the event of an earthquake. If you're standing on the sidewalk when this happens, watch out. Then the building can collapse and the floors can fall down on top of each other. You don't want to be in the building when that's happening either. So what happens with the retrofit? They tie back the parapet wall, making it less likely to fall down onto the street, and they tie the walls and the floors together using rosettes and bolts that go way into the floor. So these are some of our beautiful URM buildings in the city of Seattle. We've got 7 here on the list, and we have formally addressed 1. But there's other buildings. They have seismic deficiencies, not technically URM, but they still present really serious safety risks in the event of an earthquake. And when you rehab these buildings, these retrofit requirements are triggered. And it does include buildings beyond straight up brick construction. One example here is our Centennial property. The parking structure here is supported by these very thin columns. And in an earthquake, that portion of the structure could collapse if those columns break, and that could be very bad. So not technically URM, but still quite vulnerable.
Thanks, Lisa. So we wanted to talk about 2 different projects that have come through the real estate development department. I think this one's better. Okay. And I just wanted to point out that when we're thinking about this, there was kind of like 2 ways these projects came into our department. One of them was planned. It was in our pipeline. It was identified on the list. We paired it. Well, we'll talk about more about it, but we kind of had an idea that this was a project that was going to need to be addressed, but it came through as being identified as being on that list. And we have another property that, was one of these.
The one up on the upper right.
This one. And we'll get into details on that one too, but it wasn't formally on the list, but as you kind of notice buildings needing capital repairs, if one system fails, and you need to, like, if it triggers a second system needing to be repaired to replace the first, then it triggers the sub-alt, and then you need to bring the building up to building code, which means you're also going to have to do a seismic upgrade. So it's just identifying that, like, you're gonna get there one way or the other. The city is kind of like funneling you in through the need to improve your buildings and get them up to a seismic standard. And so I just kind of wanted to talk about how we got there with both of these different projects, how we put together the financing, and where they are today. So the first one is a resyndication project. This was Bonanza. There included 3 separate properties, and one of them, the Elnor, included a seismic upgrade. It was a total $44 million project. There are 87 units. There's a HUD contract on all 3 of the buildings. We performed an occupied rehab with a seismic retrofit, right? So we did this project. We closed in 2019. We placed the buildings we placed the units in service in 2020. The 3 properties are in proximity to one another, and they all needed a certain amount of rehab, though Elnor by far needed the most. And so what we were able to do was to make these projects scale to attract our low-income housing tax credit investments, to secure the public financing. We kind of packaged these 3 together. 18th Street needed some exterior repairs, some interior unit upgrades, but not complete system repairs. Same with Ponderosa, but the Elnor was our URM building, and so we needed to move residents out from that building for a year and take it down to the studs, replace all the systems, provide those seismic upgrades. So looking at the Elnor itself, it is a 55-unit building. The HUD contract related to it was to provide units for very low-income seniors. It was originally comprised of 2 buildings, so there was the Eleanor and then the North building, and one was built prior to the other. So the earlier constructed building was a URM, and then the North building was not a URM, but then in the 70s, somebody combined the 2 buildings. There was like a little combining gasket here, and we purchased
an elevator in there too.
We purchased the building in the 90s and then resyndicated it in 2019. Let's see, the sources and uses. This is looking at the total project of the Bonanza. I want to point out one of the things that really made this project work was the fact that it did have those HUD contracts and that we were able to renegotiate the value of those contracts and increase them to market. So in the Elnor alone, rents that we were collecting on that contract increased from $900 to about $1,350. So that was a pretty big difference per unit, and enabled us to get a decent permanent loan on this project. But really, it was coming in with the tax credit equity and all of the state, city second loans that really got us over the finish line. But we also, it was an AC rehab, so whoops. Something to point out still is we had a seller's note, and then I think some of that additional value from the seller's note we also put in as a loan to the project. And then it was occupied, so we did get a little bit of income during the rehab too that we attributed to the project. So, you know, the seller's note and this loan to ourselves aren't really things that we anticipate really getting paid back in the long run, but they're also able to contribute into the financing and help us get a little additional tax credits into the project. One thing I wanted to make sure you think about when you're doing a rehab, especially a seismic rehab that requires residents move out, is that residents can only be out for up to a year. So it's really important to work with your contractor to schedule and phase those move outs so that that no one resident is out for more than a year, or that would trigger the permanent relocation. And so I think that's another note there is, your contractor, these are, even when their residents are relocated, I'm gonna say they're out for a year, but our construction timelines are probably about 18 months long. So residents are kind of phased in and out for up to a year, but there will be work happening in the building while residents are there. So that's one of the things that's important to communicate to residents, but it's also really important to find a contractor who can work under those conditions. So you're gonna have to close off portions of the building to residents so that they're not in the construction areas. You're gonna have to be able to communicate that to people. But really, they also need to really think about the phasing of the work that they're going to perform with that clock of the 1 year for residents in mind. So they need to move residents out and back in that time period. So I was not on staff for this particular project, so I don't know the logic here for what's happening, but it's often like we'll do a floor by floor, or there might be stacks of plumbing that kind of drive wanting to move out this as phase 1 first, so that way I can get at that plumbing stack, and when I turn off the water there, it doesn't impact the other residents that stay in the building. So there's considerations to make, and you really want to make sure your contractor understands those, is putting together their work schedule in a way that complies with the relocation requirements as well. Here's a brief look at some before pictures. One thing, there's a senior building, everyone is very excited about their garden space. So one of the things we were able to include in the upgrade as well was an irrigation system and some improvements to the garden. With this boiler system from I don't know when. Being a sub-alt required all new systems and bringing the building up to current energy and building codes. So all of this was addressed in the rehab. You can see a little bit of that here. The boiler went here, but we had to dig out more space in the basement, make sure these support columns were then tied into the structure. You see a little bit here, some additional lateral bracing installed under the walls. What you don't see here is that the hallway is likely to be all rigid plywood, and then the gypcrete put on top. So those are the things that are really adding that stability to the building in case of a earthquake. And then there were these rosettes kind of added to the outside as well. And here's completed. So yeah, this was our first URM improvement that we put through the pipeline, and was one of the things that was also really successful about it for us was the relocation went really well. Residents were really excited to come back to their refreshed units. And one of the challenges too is a majority of the residents living in the building did not speak English. So this was really needed to be considered in our relocation communications. Keys to success. It's really like work with your team. You're gonna need your team early. You're gonna need a different team than you might in a new construction project, right? So, and your team really also, I'm thinking about this in terms of our tag teaming this presentation, because it really includes more of the staff on the organization than our new construction projects, right? Because asset management has already spent a lot of time on these buildings trying to figure out what's going on, what repairs need to get made. They're working with a capital repairs manager to scope out that work and see when it triggers a more comprehensive rehab project. We're working with site managers who know the building well, know the residents well. That's all part of our early project team as we work on a project. But it's also making sure your architect has experience with existing historic buildings, making sure you have the right structural engineers that can provide the reports you need and guidance on these historic buildings. And that like I said, that your contractor they're going to be talking to your residents more than you are during construction. So they really need to be prepared for that and know what that means.
The last 2 bullet points,
Go
I'll
ahead.
just mention. There was a little bit of a hiccup. We owned all 3 buildings, and then we sold them to the partnership. And the partnership requirement was that we had a minority owner as part of our general partnership.
Yep.
So we had a really strong relationship with a mission-driven, affordable housing provider that was willing to partner with us. And that really made this deal work. I don't remember, but I don't think they realized this until we were well down the path. So plan to improvise.
Yeah, I mean, this because we have the seller's note and the sponsor's loan that comes into this project, for the tax credits to flow right, we needed to have a non-affiliated partner in the project, right? And this came, in the next project, this came up as well. We're a government entity, so we kind of thought we might be able to, because we're a PDA, we might be able to kind of skirt that a little bit differently, but at the end of the day, at the last minute, we still needed to bring in a minority partner into the project. So quickly, and I don't know if Josh is still here, but Skipta helped us on this one, so kudos. Okay, so the current one that we're working on is the Devonshire. This is one I know a lot more about because I worked on closing this one. But we just closed this one in September, so just a couple weeks ago we got to our financial closing. This is a project that has 62 units, studios and 1 bedrooms, low-income individuals at 50 and 60% AMI, and was not on the URM list, but we'll get to why it is here now. This was a building that was originally constructed in 1925. It's located in Belltown. There had been no significant upgrades to the property in nearly 100 years. We purchased it in the early 90s, did some cosmetic work, but most systems were at the end of its useful life. Here you get a kind of a idea of where it is. It's right here next to the Seattle Center. You've got the Space Needle. The monorail goes right next door to it. And something to note is how much the neighborhood has changed since this building was originally constructed. So, we have a 3-story building here, and it's surrounded by much higher density, which kind of brings us to where we are. It's part of the history of the project and why rehab was so important. But we'll get there. This is what happened. But we purchased the project in 1993. In 2001, 2005, we transferred some developer rights that would have allowed us to build taller in that district. So currently, when we're looking at this project, we did not have that zoning, that FAR available to us to demolish it and build it up. So, and we sold those in the early 2000s because we had a repair to our plumbing that needed to be made. And so with the sale of those rights, we fixed our galvanized pipes with an epoxy lining that lasted about 20 years, and then it mobilized and clogged our pipes. So in 2001, plumbing was there any plumbing in the building? It was like maybe a couple units had plumbing. I don't know, maybe half of the building?
I think about a quarter of the building at one point was out of water for quite some time, maybe weeks up to a month, and it was expensive. We had to have various different stopgap repairs to clear out the gunk that had been falling off the inside of the pipe and coming down the line. It was coming out residents' sinks. It was going into the
all
boiler,
at once, all of a sudden, one day.
Mucking it up. Yeah.
And we kind of like cut out a piece and patched it and figured, but the system was still largely intact. And the potential for this to happen again was real. So we were really motivated to get into a complete plumbing repair to keep residents with water. But once we are opening up the walls and replacing the plumbing, then we're touching a lot of other systems. which was putting us dangerously close to a sub-alt. But then, we're also thinking about the fact that public subsidies and sources of money are very limited, and the opportunity to get access to those is rare. So you don't want to just ask for, what would have, like $3 million? I don't even know what would have been just to fix the plumbing if that would have been possible, right? Like, it would have been a sizable amount of money anyways, and so it's kind of like, but then the boiler is old and the roof needs to be replaced. And so that capital needs assessment that kind of gave us an outline of the fact that many of the systems in the building were at or near the end of their useful life, and were going to trigger, to replace them would trigger the sub-alt, which would then require the seismic and building code upgrades. The scope of work that we were able to include in the project included a number of life safety improvements. This was something that we talked about, maybe the units are gonna change, what units you have. Well, bringing your building up to life safety codes, surprisingly, like through some like egress stairs and we were really solving for a lot of potential issues that could have changed the number of units in the building. Ultimately, we did not need to do that, but it's something that comes up and you need to consider. We created new ADA units. We're gonna do some repairs to the masonry, fix the roof, new windows and doors, new concrete shear wall in the basement to kind of help everything stay together, and some additional seismic upgrades to minimize impact in an earthquake event, and then all new mechanical and plumbing especially. And the units will look new. So this gives us a look at what the units look like today. They're small studios, they have large closets in the middle. It's like an interesting time to build. There was like maybe a built-in refrigerator in the cabinet.
It was like, I don't know, if you put your baked goods in there, you put your oven, I have no idea.
I don't know.
There's some weird closet in there.
But units, will largely, stay the same configuration, same number of units in the end, but bathrooms will be bigger for ADA accommodations. Kitchens will be bigger. So this area almost was a closet before, but now it kind of becomes a smaller closet and a bathroom and a smaller bedroom. So units will be pretty impacted, but at the end of the day, they'll be a nice livable unit. And then here's another example of a unit, but that's, sources and uses. We were able to, this one was like kind of right at a cusp of a size where we were able to attract low-income housing tax credit investor to the project without needing to combine it with a couple of other projects. So that was nice. So we're just kind of focused on the one building, and
Now, I would have preferred that they included more buildings, but they didn't have time for that.
we didn't, yeah, this was because of the plumbing considerations and the system's failure. We were really just trying to get this project to construction financing as quickly as possible. So, that was still a 2-year clock from the moment, 2.5 year maybe, from the moment the initial plumbing failure occurred to when we were able to complete our financing. But that was really light speed in our world, so yeah. Questions?
Hello, this is actually a question regarding an alternative financing source in the first part of the slides around capital campaign. Can you explain what that alternative source might be? I mean, other than passing around a hat, I'm like, what does that mean?
Well, here, I'll talk. So Community Roots Housing has a foundation. It's the Community Roots Housing Foundation, and we engaged in various different capital campaigns. So our staff go out and find donors who really want to support affordable housing, and they generate the capital that is sort of missing in the gap. That made a success out of our 12th Avenue Arts project. It's going to make a success out of our the Africatown Plaza project. Some of our other partnerships are benefiting from some of our capital campaigns. So really having that foundation partnering with Community Roots Housing has been fundamental in being able to do some of the harder work where you've got a gap that you just can't fill.
It's exciting stuff.
So what kind of improvements are you looking at doing? Are you looking at using some of the new money that's out there from the Build Back Better Act, which, by the way, is a session tomorrow? Are you looking at those kind of things?
I will say we have done 3. Well, we're at the start of the construction of one, but 3 of our projects that were identified as seismic risk projects, we have rehabbed. And so one of them was the Bremer. I didn't talk about that one in detail, but we financed that one through money from the Seattle Office of Housing, bank debt, and FEMA. So FEMA provided a grant. I think it was a pilot grant. I think they're going to do more, but that one for me would be like, be aware that it is federal financing and funding, so that may impact your audits moving forward to include federal funds in that way. So be aware of that. And then it's not a program that they're used to funding yet, so it's not an emergency disaster response. It wasn't individual homeowners. It was a different program for them, and payback on those on that source has been very slow. We are fortunate that the Office of Housing provided us a floating loan on that until we get reimbursed from FEMA, but that's a potential funding source, so it could be more available in the future.
So it took California 30 years to work through their stock of properties that needed retrofitting. How long do you think it would take, like in your stock, to get through it?
Well, I think they're more than 10 years in now, and they're still saying it's relatively early stages. Some of their, they need to get the funding together. That's sort of the thing I'm seeing different from what happened in Southern California, is they are becoming much more cognizant from the feedback they're getting from the community that you just can't put this unfunded mandate out. We really need to find a funding source, particularly for affordable.
Yeah, and I guess I didn't really get there. I started to get at it, but I forgot to kind of land it. But, we sold our development rights for the Devonshire, and then we signed an agreement with the Department of Neighborhoods to preserve the historic facade of the building. So we were kind of in a place where it maybe would have made more sense to build up and get more density and do a complete, but we chose to do we kind of chose 20 years ago, I guess, that we would rehab the building instead of doing new construction there. Yeah. Yes.
Where do you relocate people to in a market with low vacancy?
Yeah. We work with our relocation experts. I would say residents have to be relocated within 5 miles of the existing building where they are housed. And the easiest solution is typically buildings that are coming online right at the time that you need residents to be relocated. So that's been a source that we've gone to, or what are the new projects that are in lease up, and how can this be a win-win for them to have a kind of a quick fill of units. Something to be mindful of is their lenders may have restrictions on corporate leases, and essentially it's not quite, we master lease the units from another property owner. So yeah.
Your own
And
units too.
We can, yeah.
Depending on the rules, yeah.
This was something else I mentioned kind of off before we started, but have a healthy relocation budget. So, it's like a line in the budget you should put your thumb on, because you don't know what's going to happen. So your residents are going to be out for up to a year. You're going to want to move them back in. I mean, you want the units to be safe and habitable, but you're going to want to get them back in. But there may be ongoing things happening to the building. Like there may be final testing of the boiler that happens, and the hot water will be out, and you're going to need to have ability to either have residents out for a day while you test the boiler system, or have gift cards you can give them to go do something for the day so they're not inconvenienced by the water being off. So you're going to get creative, but make sure that there's available money within your budget to provide that to residents. Yes.
So you might not want to share this or know it off the top of your head, but speaking of relocation, like if you were underwriting and modeling for an acquisition here, non-seismic related, just kind of more standard AC rehab, what are you plugging in for your per unit relocation cost?
I'm in Seattle. And our experience is that the units that you're relocating folks to need to be market rate units, and so market rate in Seattle within 5 miles of Belltown, I'd say it was over $2,000 a month per unit per rent. And then you have to move them out, you're gonna move them back in, you're gonna pay their utilities, you're gonna pay if they had parking with you, you're gonna have to pay parking at the new unit for them.
Movers to move their belongings.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need to provide help for them to pack their belongings and then unpack belongings. These can be, reasonable accommodations.
They may need storage.
So yeah,
Our 62 unit building, I'd say our relocation budget is over $2 million. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. That's what I want to do.
Yeah. And this one we did consider income averaging on. So this is a building we had owned for a long time. A number of residents were paying rents that were about 30% AMI. It was not ever a LIHTC project in the past. So we were just trying to get creative about how do we keep people's rents low, but also finance this project. But we were going out for our investors at the same time that the new rules from the IRS or the clarity was pending, and so it was like investors were particularly nervous at that moment in time, not knowing what guidance they were going to get. So we did not. But I think it could have been a good project to consider that more in depth. Yeah.
Although the rent increase restrictions in the city might have confounded some of those efforts.
Yeah. Yeah. Alternatively, we were able to, I guess there was a number of folks who were paying at or below 30% AMI, but there were a handful of folks who over time had become over income, which was fine under our existing agreements with all of our funders, but it being a new LIHTC project was going to make people get income certified in ways they hadn't yet been certified, and put people at risk for being permanent relocated. So we did a little bit of permanent relocation before we started the project based off of residents reporting that their incomes had increased over 60% since move-in.
Were there any grants or funding available for sustainability incentives, like water, electricity efficiencies?
Let's say, yes, and on the Elnor, I think we had a weatherization grant, maybe a solar grant. I think these parts of the capital stack maybe added up to $1 million. And a $45 million project, yeah.
We didn't have that kind of time to line up some of those smaller funding sources for the Devonshire, but with the Elnor, we had this planned out, so it was easier to add everything up.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Well, it's almost celebration time, but first, let's celebrate all of our presenters today.